need to finish writing it. I need to revise it.
What about if you send it next Sunday and we have 24 hours to raise Monday?
Or Monday.
Saturday night to Sunday.
Okay, so how many people want it Tuesday, return it on Wednesday?
Yeah, I can do Tuesday.
I'll send it Friday, return it on Saturday. Or no, I'll send it, what?
Saturday to Monday.
Saturday to Sunday.
I go Sunday to Monday, the 27th to the 28th.
How many people want Sunday to Monday?
Tomorrow.
Because then you have like a whole day to do
A week
it.
from tomorrow.
I wait for tomorrow. Who were the Tuesday to Wednesday people? Have you now all changed to Sunday? Is that just a simple classroom, put it up as long as possible?
So wait,
No, it's because we were.
so since if we're gonna do Sunday to Monday, does that mean it incorporates the information we have to read for next class? Oh wait, oh no, it doesn't.
No.
How many hours do you think if we took good notes and knew the material a little bit that it would take to take the test?
I don't think it takes, but a few hours. But I might.
How many questions?
What about a few? I mean,
We'd rather have a few hours.
I am anticipating that you won't know the answer to every question off the top of your head, and you'll need to do some research to answer some of them, and that takes time. That's the only reason. What was your question?
Just for those of us who have full-time jobs aside from this,
Yeah.
on a weekend would be
Better than a.
yeah. So the
Yeah.
Sunday.
Sunday the 27th,
Okay.
6 a.m.
No, I see them on Sunday.
I just don't want to shit my pants on that. Taking the test.
Sunday the 27th, and you have
It's
to.
I would be distracted.
Monday morning, sleep tired, put work
Okay, that's what it'll be.
We have a football necklace real quick.
What's that? Is that
Subjective because of football.
Sunday's a sacred. It's a religious day.
Takes 2 hours. 2 hours for Sunday. You get it done. Sunday for grad school, it's gonna be hard work. Get over it.
Is this gonna be a personalized test?
What time?
Is the same question everybody?
It will be multiple choice, true, false, and short answer. It will be the same test to everyone. It will be based on what we will have covered in these first 2 classes. I don't think I'm going to actually have an essay other than the short answers. That's it. That's it.
Multiple choice?
Oh,
we love you.
Right.
No, this is individual work. All right, listen to me. This is open book, but yes, individual work. Okay? I might never know, but you will. Do not confer with one another. This is your test. This is not a group test. Okay? And I'm acting, whatever voice your mother would speak into your head that makes you feel guilty if you're a bad person, that's the voice you're coming from me right now. Okay? Yes?
What's the closeout time on that Monday?
It will be, I don't,
End of business, so 5,
it will
6?
probably be, generally I give 24 hours. So whenever I send it, 24 hours from the time the email goes out, but I understand for your planning purposes it would help for you to know when this is.
Yeah, how much football am I
Why don't I send it?
Is there no way you can set it up so that you can clock us from the time we actually read the email?
No. Could you do like
It's too
noon?
complicated for me.
Could you do noon, like noon to noon? That would be great.
I think what I'm going to do is 9 p.m. Sunday to 9 p.m. Monday, okay? What, is it a Monday night football too?
Could you rearrange your
Test around.
Oh, Monday night. That's good, that's good, that's good.
Do the test before the football game. Wake up early, go to church, do the test.
Is this venting, is all this kvetching and venting that I'm hearing, is this therapeutic for you? 'Cause I'll let you go for a while, but I'm gonna stop kvetching.
Monday morning.
Sunday.
We're having a weekend, I would like the whole day Sunday at least.
Right, exactly.
Yes, that's the same.
Okay, wait. So, what, so you don't want it Sunday evening to Monday evening? You want it Sunday morning?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wait a second, Sunday morning?
Yeah.
Sunday morning.
Sunday noon to Monday noon.
That makes sense.
Sunday noon to Monday noon?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect.
I mean, I don't care.
Noon to noon is good.
I was just trying to help you out.
I mean, because I can queue up the emails to go automatically when I want them to, so I don't, it doesn't affect me when I send it.
Noon Sunday, we're gonna miss half Sunday then, if that's the case.
But
That's okay.
We work Monday, guys.
Yeah, but you only have 2 hours for the test though. I mean,
I'm making no promises about how long it's gonna take you
Well,
to.
who wants Sunday morning instead of noon?
Yeah, you're,
No.
yeah,
We
you're
don't wake up early on
by
Sunday.
doing that.
Noon is
Like, go to work Sunday?
If you
No.
work.
Right, but I ain't gonna
Noon is fine.
put it on new.
I guess it depends on what time you go to bed.
Noon is good. I can leave my 3 days straight.
yeah, we do right now.
3 days straight.
All right, that's the way I'm gonna leave it, that's the way I'm gonna leave it, okay? Any,
Break after
after that, it was traumatic. You know, and I've got like no sympathy for any of you with this test because in law school, we had no tests, no assignment of any kind. We had a 4-hour essay exam at the end of every course, period, and the entire grade.
So why don't we do that?
That was law school, okay? So I think my test is, that's what law school was like.
So, are we still gonna have a final test due?
We are. So, okay, so here's the deal.
Noon to noon on the final too.
The final is going to be cumulative.
Oh.
And if your grade on the final is better than your grade on the midterm, I will replace your midterm grade with your final grade. Okay, I'm not dropping any grades, but if your final on the cumulative final is better, I'll take that as your midterm grade. The weighting is this. The case study is 20%, the midterm is 30%, the research paper is 20%, the final is 30%. Let me make sure that I write that down so I don't forget. 20 case, 30 30%.
Yeah.
But if the final and the midterm are 30% each, does it make a difference to not does that each 30%?
Well, she's gonna replace one of the others.
You get rewarded for good behavior.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying.
It's not if we score higher on the midterm than the cumulative, you're not gonna count that one.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, so the research is 20.
Research is 20, case study is 20, midterm is 30, final is 30.
I mean, I'm thinking about this, I don't know, maybe you mentioned it, but the test is like, we have to send it back to you, or it's like a live table sign?
No, you have to send it, it's just, it's a Word file. You're gonna insert your answers in the Word file and email it back to me.
How many questions?
I don't know.
She has to
I'll
look at
have to
the-
go to the other, I have to write it yet.
It covers through today's lecture.
Yes.
Yes.
And there may be questions that derive from the reading. There may be. Yeah.
What about the case studies? studies, I mean, I read the case studies, but do we have to know like exactly name or just like to know just about what was the conclusion of the case studies?
On the legal cases that are covered in the
Yeah.
reading, no, you need to know, you need to associate the importance of the decision with the name a little bit. You know, I don't want citations or anything, but you need to know that Hadachek was about this, and Dolan and Nolan, what they stand for, and combine what the implication, what the importance of those cases are.
Do you normally give a template as to what you expect the case study to look like? Otherwise, you could have a real flurry of formats coming back at you.
I've been thinking about that, and I have seen a vast array of things come back as the case study, and I really don't want to give you a template. I'm okay with a lot of variety in the way you present your case studies. Okay? And the research paper is, again, the format will depend a great deal on the topic that you suggest, and it is a research paper. You do have to cite to the sources that you're using, but in terms of writing style, think more about trying to write an interesting article about that topic, okay?
Is there a page limit on that?
15 pages.
The case studies, those cases that you have discussed in class.
Pardon?
The case studies, those that you have discussed in class.
When I use the term case study, I'm really talking about the assignment that you have for a case study. There are legal decisions, cases that are referred to in the reading and that we covered in the PowerPoint. Those legal cases, I think, is what the earlier question was about. Do those ring a bell? You know, Penn Central, Hadachek, Dolan, Nolan, Euclid, Ambler versus Ambler Realty. You need to know enough about what the holding, and that's a legal term for what the ultimate decision of the court was, what importance that had to land use regulation, and enough about the facts to understand why that case was important in the context of land use regulation. So extreme detail about the facts, no. You do not need to know that, but enough about the facts to understand why it became an important land use case.
And then that will be
It will be, there will probably be stuff on the midterm and the final on those really important land use cases.
I'm not sure if you said this or not, but is the final, are you gonna do the final the same way as the midterm, or is that?
I am going to do the final the same way as the midterm. Now, I need to find out when my grades are due so that we can time the final so I have an opportunity to get the grades done. I am not good at complying with Dr. Forty's diet requirements.
I'm sorry if I missed this. Is the final going to be kind of the same format? Email it out?
Yes.
In the 24 hours?
Yes, it will be.
Do you have a date for that?
No, you need to know that.
I need to find out. I need to find out when I'm going to have to post my grades, and I'll have to back it up from then.
Will we have a chance to argue
About the grade. When I return your midterms, we'll find time to talk about if you really do not understand the grading, the scoring of your midterm, and you want to talk about it, we'll find a way to sit down and talk about that. Because again, the way that I'm trying to structure the midterm is to help you get a great grade on the final, all right? So I want it to be a process where if you're like, if I've taken all kinds of points and you really don't understand why, and we'll find a way to sit down and review that together so you can learn more how to answer those questions and what I'm looking for.
Feedback.
When is it that we're gonna be doing the, I don't know what it's called, where we each have to rotate and defend ourselves?
In the last class, well, you're doing the presentations on your case studies next time, in the
Right.
next class.
Right.
Then during the last class, I'm going to distribute a mythical, a fictional
Right.
scenario, and that's when we're going to do that exercise, where I'm going to divide you up into the developer, so the applicant, the city staff, maybe the elected officials, and neighborhood opposition. and you're going to sort of present the project, and you're going to shift roles and look at the project again. So it's very easy to become associated with only one point of view in this process. If you're a developer, if you're a neighborhood activist, if you're elected officials are all over the place, but or you're a staff that's used to saying no, 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 because that's the mindset of your city at that time. It's very easy to lose the perspective of the other participants, and you can't afford to do that. You need to be able to see a project through the eyes of the staff that's reviewing it, understand the life that they live, the people they have to answer to. You need to give them what they need to protect, to cover their back, okay? You need to be truthful with them at all times. When you say you're going to give them something, you give it to them. You need to build trust with them because it's going to pay off in the long run. So that's the kind of, all of that won't necessarily come through in this one exercise, but I found it to be very helpful to the students last year to participate in that. Okay. Other housekeeping questions? Anything else right now?
Pretty good.
Okay. So we're getting down into the nitty-gritty. We've walked our way through the comprehensive planning structure. We understand that the comprehensive plan is the all-encompassing constitution, authority of land development decisions, and it filters down to typically zoning. And this is like the sort of muddy pit that we wallow around in trying to get a project approved. All the details that are buried into the zoning regulations. And I'm calling it tools from here on out, because a tool is something that exists independently, but it really only has meaning when it's applied to a specific situation. So these regulations in zoning codes tend to be very detailed, and you can read through them, and they don't really mean anything until you start trying to apply them to a project. So we're going to try to get a good understanding of the type of regulations that are buried within these zoning codes and land development regulations, and how we can apply them and work with them. I wasn't able to get much of a map up before. I wonder if I can this time. That's interesting. Example of a zoning map. Looks a lot like a land use map, but it's more granulated, if we can put it that way. It's the parcels that might have separate and distinct zoning are more finely granulated. Let's see if I can find an example here. Beach, because if we all plan our lives very carefully, maybe we can live there someday. So here we are. We see this red color surrounding this little patch of brown. So let's see what that might mean for this RM, what's called RM30 here, and it has the color of brown. This brown, it's
Public space.
okay. Here's zoning.
Residential medium 30 per acre.
multifamily residence, RM 30 per acre. All right, so that's your zoning category. Now, I want to caution you, these maps get updated periodically, and sometimes they don't keep them up to date on their websites. So you need to follow up, you need to make a phone call, you need to do something called a zoning confirmation letter. Has anybody ever, in the course of your work, had to ask for a zoning confirmation letter? Yeah. Most cities have it. Sometimes there's a fee, sometimes there's a big honking fee, sometimes it's a small reasonable fee. And they'll provide different kinds of information. Some cities, when you make that request, will tell you only, this is the land use, this is the zoning. Thank you very much, have a nice day. Some of them will tell you more detail if you ask the questions. You can ask, are there any code violations? And sometimes they'll tell you, and sometimes they'll point you down the hall to a different office. So you have to ask them and pay them a fee too. So you ask as much as you want. You might or not, you might get it, you might not. But almost always, if you pay a fee and you ask in accordance with their procedure, you can get confirmation from them that this is the actual zoning that applies to your property. There's another caution. Sometimes these zoning maps have only the base or as of right zoning, and cities do things called overlays. All right, so you can see that you have RM30 zoning, you can evaluate the zoning code and what it says about RM30, and you can be very comfortable with it, and then you find out that on a different map, it's subject to an overlay that completely changes the analysis of your project. There's nothing that requires them to show all of those overlays on the same map. There's nothing that requires them to even have a map for those overlays. And let me talk to you about why they do something, why cities will do something like an overlay. If they have a special, they might have a special concern about an area, but they don't want to go in and wholesale modify the zoning because they could get sued. If they downzone, in other words, if they change the zoning on their own initiative as the city to reduce the density or the height, that can generate a lawsuit. But if they adopt an overlay that says you can only fully utilize the density or the height subject to these criteria, and we have an opportunity to review it in the context of your architecture and design and your community open space, then they're less likely to get sued. So it's a way of them rezoning it without going through a rezoning process. So be aware that the zoning, what's shown on the zoning map, or even what's told in your zoning confirmation letter, might not be the whole story. Ask those questions when you ask for zoning confirmation letters. Is it subject to any overlay? Is it subject to any plan development approval? Was it approved by a site plan, and can I get a copy? They might or might not give it to you in response to a zoning confirmation request.
Now that you're speaking on overlay and whatnot, because I dealt with that in my previous job, I just want to better understand if there's an overlay of commercial and residential, and then once you get into like the certificate of occupancy, it says you have to have a community facility and whatnot. Do you have to build that in there, or can I just do all residential, or just do a whole commercial?
It depends on the regulations. It does. I mean, let me think of an example. There was a city, an older city in Broward County that had a lot of existing development on its beachfront. There was concern at a state level about evacuation times for hurricanes. There was a concern locally about heights and shadows that were being cast on the beach. So let's say they make a portion of the beach where all these sensitivities exist, subject to a beach redevelopment overlay process. So they have a site plan process, they have a zoning code, but if you're located in this area of special concern, you have to go through a whole additional process of review. That's how they typically administer an overlay. It gives them a chance as a city, when they have a set of concerns that the neighbors have or that the elected officials have, to get their foot in the door and say, you don't have all of this development as of right, we have an opportunity to review it with you and analyze it according to the criteria in our overlay ordinance, whatever the overlay is called. Sometimes you'll see these, the air park zoning can exist separate from the zoning in some sort of overlay. If the property is adjacent to or is near a river or a watershed of some kind, you'll find additional regulations for that watershed area to be in an overlay, the watershed area overlay, or something that they might call it. So it's just a caution. I can't even begin to list all of the different variations that this could take. That the zoning as of right that you find on the map, or that you might even get in your zoning confirmation letter, might not be the whole story. You need to do some searches in the code for overlay areas and similar words to find out if a set of regulations like that might apply to your property. Okay? So that's an example of how we start the discussion. Oh, look, Atlantic Boulevard Overlay District, Downtown Pompano Beach Overlay District. At least they're showing it to you on the map. And you don't know what it means until you go to the code, call the city if you can't figure it out, and find out what the criteria are that are going to apply to your project because you're located in this overlay. All right? So the zoning regulations, sometimes they're called the zoning code, sometimes they're called the Unified Land Development Regulations, sometimes they're called the Land Development Code. But we're going to use the generic term zoning regulations. There'll be a provision that says the following categories are adopted, and they have the force of law, and nothing will be built in our city except in compliance with these regulations. Okay, they are regulatory, they are the law in the city. And that's what the city staff is going to be administering. The first tranche of regulations you're going to find is typically the permitted uses. You can find it in a couple of different ways. Some zoning codes will list them. You'll go to the Pompano Beach RM30 and you'll look for a list of permitted uses. Some of them use these vast tables. So every single zoning district in the city is listed on one column, and they have permitted, conditional, X for not permitted, whatever the key on the table says. Sometimes they have these tables that are difficult to read, but you need to find the source of the permitted use regulations and review it for what you want to do in your project. Pyramidal or specific. So what do I mean by this? Does anybody know what I mean by pyramid zoning? Any ideas? So pyramid zoning, you'll see something like this. You'll look at the base level of, let's say, commercial. They usually use B for business or C for commercial. So you'll look at B1 and it'll have a list of 24 uses. And then you go to the next most intense commercial use, B2, and it'll say, in addition to all of the uses permitted in B1, you can have a car dealership and something more intense and something else. Another set of permitted uses that are slightly more intense than what was permitted in B1. And then you go to B3, and what do you see? In addition to what is permitted in B1 and
More
B2,
intensity.
you can have this additional list of permitted uses that are more intense.
So an inverse pyramid?
It's an inverse pyramid. I guess it's an inverse pyramid. So understand that, and don't sort of just breeze over it, because you might look at the B3 and you're like, what do you mean I can't have a shopping center? This is the most intense commercial use in the city. How can I not be allowed to have a shopping center? Well, you can, because if you look at B2, it's right there, and it's a pyramid structure. So just don't breeze past it. Some of them are not that way. It's a specific list of uses. Some of them piggyback on their comprehensive plan. They say that this zoning district is consistent with the commercial land use designation, and you can have any use that's permitted there. So you got to go find that text in the comprehensive plan that we went and looked at in Fort Lauderdale that says what the permitted uses are in the land use. This is how you filter through what the permitted uses are on any particular piece of land And understand that there's nothing uniform from one city to another. They can be, some of them will look an awful lot alike, but they can be as different as they wish. Now, sometimes you have a use that is not addressed. You're investigating the feasibility of something new or different than what was contemplated at the time that the zoning code was adopted. And you have uncertainty, and you're not sure what it's going to be permitted in. I have a client who finds existing commercial buildings and he repurposes them into a certain type of mixed use, which is office, self-storage for the office use, for the small office user, warehouse, and then he does ground floor commercial, or when he can. It's an interesting approach to repurposing large vacant commercial buildings.
So is that a mix kind of finding a building before the 40-year?
I'm sorry?
I'm assuming he's finding them before the 40-year, correct?
With his projects, I don't know if he's encountered a 40-year inspection requirement, but it's not really pertinent to the zoning. So we've struggled with this with him, that kind of mixed commercial use isn't always addressed in the zoning code at all. So what do you do when that's the type of use that you're investigating? There's usually a zoning officer given authority to determine that a proposed use that's not listed is more like some other use that is listed. Or it's similar enough in terms of the impact to be treated in the same way. And that's the key. When the zoning officer is evaluating a use that is not addressed in the zoning code at all, the focus should be, what is the impact of this use on my community? Not, do we like it? Do we think it's ugly? Do we object to it on some moral grounds? It's not that. They have to look at impact. So there could be administrative procedures that allow you to challenge that determination if it's not rational. Okay? So be aware of it. Again, call your lawyer. It's an administrative procedure, but it usually exists. And if you don't know it's there, then you're going to miss the deadlines associated with it. So if my client wanted to propose his commercial mixed use and he received a determination that it was not permitted in any commercial zoning district in the city, we would have to pay close attention and see what opportunity we had to challenge that. Really? Can we appeal that to the director of the department? Can we appeal that to your planning and zoning board? Because they're going to administer your zoning code, with some. Can we appeal that to the city commission? How do we get this determination reversed? Be aware of it. It usually has to be done quickly if it's going to be done at all.
Is that because of opposition that we would come into it as soon as you bring it up?
It can be. Back in the 70s when self-storage facilities started popping up, that was an example where many zoning codes didn't address it at all. That warehouses were something that businesses had. They weren't something that individual people had, where they were driving in and out to store their junk. So self-storage facilities were not regulated carefully, and cities started pushing back on those uses. And initially the pushback was, there's nothing in the zoning code that permits it, therefore you cannot. So you have to start the process of, it's really very much like this use, and you do permit this use. Why do I say it's like that use? Because it's going to generate the same traffic. It's not going to generate any more noise, dust, or hazard. It's going to have the same impact on the community as this other use that you do permit. That's the argument, this kind of unspecified use. I'm trying to think of an example. Okay, for the same client, one of the uses he wants to put in his commercial building was someone that wants to do indoor tennis and soccer, and it wasn't permitted by the city zoning code. But we went and we had a discussion with him about, you permit skating rinks and you permit bowling alleys, but you prohibit indoor tennis. That doesn't make any sense. So we proposed a zoning code amendment to allow the use, and it's in process now, and so far has the city's support. But again, you have to focus on, you have to find the use that's most like it from an impact analysis, because that's what the zoning regulations are supposed to be protecting, is the character of the community and the impact of the proposed development. Okay, so.
Question, sorry, before we move forward. So that's the difference when I was reading the book between variance and special permits. That's the difference. That the permit, special permit, you like that example that you just gave.
No, we haven't. This is a discussion about unlisted uses that we think should be permitted. The next thing is about conditional, special exception, special permit.
Okay.
There will typically be in a zoning code another list, or maybe a designation on that gigantic chart of uses with a C that says conditional. Not P permitted, but C conditional, or whatever the table, whatever the legend of the chart says. And conditional uses are just that. You don't have them as of right. You have to go through a special process to get approval for the conditional use. They're not prohibited, but they have conditions attached. The zoning code will list the criteria to obtain a conditional use approval. And the staff you'll have to explain to the staff how your proposed use meets those conditions, and they'll write up an analysis, and they'll either support it or they won't. And typically, I mean, some cities may do this at an administrative level, like the zoning director can make that approval. Some of them you'll have to go to a board and have a hearing. And what comes with the conditional uses are just that, conditions. So if you have a shopping center and you want to allow a use that involves an outdoor garden center, but the zoning regulations prohibit all outdoor uses, and they say in this zoning, in this commercial zoning category, all uses must be carried on within an enclosed building, period, end. Stop, full stop. So you want to have an outdoor use, but you keep reading and you find that outdoor storage and outdoor sales can be permitted as a conditional use. And then we start getting into how can I get that authorization? They want a wall, they want a buffer, they want an opaque separation of some kind, they want lighting that's different, that's not going to cast light into the neighborhood. So they're concerned about the impact that the outdoor use would have on the neighborhood that's different and that's greater than the impact of a completely enclosed commercial use. And then they impose conditions on the development to mitigate the impact of the outdoor use. See how it works?
Yeah.
Make sense? Am I being
Something
too
like a tent.
simplistic?
Something like a tent.
Well, I mean, whatever it is. What happens when business is conducted outdoors instead of indoors? All of those things they're going to be concerned about, and they're going to want to impose conditions on your development to mitigate those. The hours that you may operate, especially if you back onto a residential, if the site backs onto a residential area, they'll want special buffers, they'll want special walls and fences, they'll want lighting restrictions, they'll want you to do a lighting plan to make sure that your light is not going to cast over into the neighborhood. And they might want to control your hours, they might want to control the hours that your trash trucks come and go, that your deliveries come and go, all of those things. So that's a conditional use. Some uses, they're okay most of the time if we plan them properly, so they're going to make sure that they have the opportunity as a city staff to plan them. And automobile uses are that way many times, although they've really cleaned up their act, those uses. Special exception uses or special permit uses. This is when we get into nomenclature that is not consistent. Okay, different cities can use in their codes a vast array of these kind of terms to define, to label these requests. It might be a special exception, it might be a special permit, but anything other than permitted as of right, you need to dig into the code far enough to find out what process you have to go through to obtain the approval and what criteria you have to meet, and if you're denied, what you can do to challenge it. Right? Does that make sense? Now we're going down even one more layer into the fiddly bowels of land development regulations. Okay, these dimensional standards. Some zoning categories will have all of these requirements, and some of them will have very, very few. You need to understand what the dimensional and bulk requirements will be for any project you're evaluating, because no matter what your density is, it can be limited by these regulations. You can be allowed 50 units per acre, but once you apply these dimensional restrictions, you just physically can't fit it on the site. So you need to evaluate a proposed project in light of the dimensional and bulk regulations too, not just the density. Some of these can be, and we're going to get into variances, my least favorite thing in the world. Some of these can be waived, varied, reduced, omitted. You have to look at procedures that you're dealing with. But understand in the first blush that the density or intensity that might be permitted maximum by the zoning and the land use can be severely restricted by the way these are applied. Minimum lot size, minimum lot width and depth. You need to understand where these things are going to be measured from. All right? So look for definitions. All these zoning codes have definitions and definitions and definitions and definitions that use other definitions. So understand where each of these dimensional criteria, how it's going to be measured. Minimum lot size, is it net or gross? What does it mean? What does that mean? Does anybody know the typical difference between net and gross in a land measurement?
Net is what you can build on, gross is the lot line.
It, as a practical matter, yes. Most of the time it's going to,
I was gonna say, when they tell you there must be some green space, would that
sometimes
include?
that can be part of it. The most common thing is whether you include adjacent rights of way and whether you include waterways that might be within the parcel or adjacent to the parcel.
And easements.
Easements, easements are almost always included in both net and gross, but a gross density will typically include that parcel's to the center line of the adjacent right-of-way. Okay, that can give you a lot more density. And if it says net, it typically means your parcel line on your survey that you own, period. But you have to look further, especially when you're adjacent to waterways or there is a waterway within your parcel, as to, for density purposes, whether the density of the water area is something you can use in your density calculation. I think in most of Broward County, you can use the term gross density, you can use the waterway, except the intercoastal waterway. You can't count that land into your gross area for density purposes. Maximum height, typical regulation, right? You need to understand how it's measured. Is it measured from engineers help me out here, is it measured from the crown of the adjacent roadway? Is it measured from, what are some of the other ways you'd measure elevation?
Sea level, the highest point you can build to.
No, I'm talking about the base. Where do you start the measurement?
Finished floor elevation.
Finished floor elevation. What are some other options that you see?
You can start
Anything
from
else?
a benchmark.
The what?
A benchmark. It's basically, there is like a round thing on the ground, look at it everywhere.
Something that's shown on the survey as a benchmark. Okay, so you need to understand how it's going to be measured.
High water level for the coastline.
Okay, so you need to understand where the measurement starts and where the measurement ends. Does it include floor-mounted equipment? Ceiling-mounted equipment. Does it include parapets from the top of the elevator? Does it include architectural parapets? If it's a sloped roof, this I've seen, which is the hardest for me. Is it the midpoint between the highest point of the roof and the lowest point of the roof? You need to understand, as you're planning your project and you're evaluating the economics of whether you can fit enough on that site to make it worth your while, understand how the height's going to be measured. Those are all in the definitions. Sometimes the definitions will be old and not updated, and you happen to know that the flood maps have changed and you're really not gonna be measured from what's in the code. So you need to understand how every one of these dimensional things is measured. Minimum setbacks. What do you need to know? Yeah.
When you make a mistake and you're a foot off, do they make them go back and redesign the whole thing, or do they mitigate that, or?
You're still in the design and approval phase?
Yeah.
Well, they're gonna make you go back and make it right, or submit an additional application for a variance, thank you very much. Which we won't support because you're being lazy, you can just go back and redesign it. Okay? You know? You made a mistake, so that's now the city's problem, we have to live with something that doesn't meet the code? I don't think so. Go back and redesign it, it's all in paper at that point, right?
But what about after it's built? That's during the approval process. What about
Not
the
pertinent right now. You're gonna do such a good job evaluating your projects and preparing them for approvals that you're not gonna have those mistakes. Okay, so let's talk about setbacks. What do you need to know to determine the effect of the setbacks? What's a setback?
Where you can place your building perimeters relative to the property line.
Yes, yes. Are they ever called anything else?
Something about encroachment. Is there like a term?
Minimum yards, yard requirements. I've just seen setback, instead of setbacks, I've seen yards, the minimum yard requirement. You need to know where they're measured from, right? Just like everything else. Is it your property line, or is it the center line of the adjacent roadway? You need to know what they really prohibit. Is it just a building, and can you put your HVAC units in the setback? Or is it just the building that you can't put in the setback? Can you have your pool, your fence in the setback? Can you have, in a commercial setting, can you have parking in the setback, just not a building? Can you put your pylon sign in the setback? You need to understand what the setback is going to regulate as you evaluate your project. Maximum impervious, let's talk about build-to lines for a second. Historically, all setback and yard requirements were minimums, because that's how a project was made compatible with its neighborhood, by putting distance between the development and its neighbors. That was really the only way, one of the only ways they knew how to do it, is to separate uses, to separate impacts. But now, today, when cities are trying to redevelop urban cores or create downtown urban centers, instead of minimum setbacks, we're seeing build-to lines, maximum setback. All right, so let's talk about in an urban core. Let's say you're fortunate enough to own 3 city blocks, and you're going to consolidate it all into one mammoth development, and you're going to have a vast plaza in front of your building, and it'll be beautiful, and the approach will be stunning, and you'll be the Class A office space in your downtown. Nope. It's an urban center. They want the buildings close to the street. They want the parking behind. They want interspersed public areas, but they want those buildings at the street because they want to activate the street with pedestrians. They want to have glass front on the building, so it's vibrant. People walking down the sidewalks that they're going to make you build extra wide are going to be able to see into your windows and see what's going on in your building, and it'll be a vibrant development. So no longer a minimum setback, but a maximum, a build-to line. You must build up to the street. You're going to encounter those. Sometimes it makes no sense at all, because a city is just starting the process of trying to create a downtown or a main street, and all the other developments are set back with acres of parking in front of them, and you're going to be the only one out there on the street inviting the pedestrians to walk by. And it makes no sense. I went through this in a city that, again, there was strip center with parking in front. And one little parcel, they insisted that it move up to the street, so it's a battle.
Miami's got a situation like that on Flagler, and what they're doing is closing, they're planning to close Flagler, so it will be a walkability area rather than driving through Flagler.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Well, closing lanes, you know, think about downtown Delray and parts of Los Olas and things like that, narrowing, taking a 4-lane road and making it a 2-lane road with on-street parking and wider sidewalks. That's, again, a typical design that they'll impose on a new downtown. But pulling the buildings to the sidewalk is part of that plan, because then they can make you do trellises to create shade, awnings, all of that stuff to make it a more pedestrian-friendly development. So now you have to watch not just for minimum setbacks, but maximum setbacks or build-to lines, and how that's going to affect your plan. Impervious. What does impervious mean?
Water doesn't go away easily.
Water doesn't, like concrete or asphalt or something that water can't go through, right? So you have to look for percent, and they're typically expressed as percentages of maximum building coverage, or maximum impervious area, or minimum, or the alternative minimum pervious area, or minimum open space will be expressed as a percentage, a minimum percentage of the site. It's all about the definitions. We need to understand what the building coverage applies to. Is it really just buildings, or is it parking? Right? That's the big distinction. Whether the building coverage definition is going to apply to the parking lot, and what you're going to do about it. Yeah.
Just hearing about the land use has me thinking about the building code, because the building code has a lot of this stuff in it. In a situation where you have a conflict between the building code and land use, which one takes place? Like which one?
Well, give me an example of something the building code says about one of these.
So let's say the building code says that the minimum setback is 15 feet from property line, and then the land use says that the maximum setback is 5 feet.
Okay. I suspect that the building code minimum setback would have to do with the, well, again, give me an example. When does, for what type of structure does the building code have a minimum setback?
It would be residential.
In the building code?
Yeah. So you have two different building codes. You have a
Yeah,
commercial
like
building
the
code and you have a
condominium
residential
building
building code. And in the residential building code, the general requirements was, I can't remember which one exactly, but there's a section that talks about setbacks.
I suspect that the more restrictive would control, whatever that is, because the building code is law and the zoning code is law. And if there's a conflict, I would say the most restrictive will control.
I give you an example. I think I understand what he's saying. Like up in New York, if you had to come in and build a high-rise building next to an established low-rise building, you'd want to separate the two, otherwise a snow buildup on the low-rise building could cause an impact on their roof. See what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So there could be a conflict between the zoning and the building code in that regard. And I think the building code would probably trump the zoning, because you don't want to impact the neighbor's property who's been there for 15, 20 years.
Right. It could, I mean, that could be, and it's just not something I've encountered before. And generally, most of these codes will say that in the event of a conflict, the most restrictive will apply. Is what you'll usually find. Minimum open space or minimum pervious. This is more what we were just talking about. It's usually expressed in percentage, and you need to understand what they mean by open space. Do they really mean from the ground to the sky, or do they just mean that you can't put a building there? This happens with taller buildings sometimes, with like the idea of a, let's call it a cereal box versus a wedding cake. Okay, they'll have different setbacks at different heights. So if what they want is a wedding cake because of shadowing or something like that, they'll say that up to 30 feet the setback is 5, and then it becomes 15, and then it becomes, above another level, it becomes 30. So you need to understand them enough to know what kind of design they're looking for.
So in that, like, wedding cake example, with open air requirements, if they had patios on those little pop outs there, that could be constituted as a open space?
It can. I've seen cities where by putting planters on those patios, it can be counted towards your open space or green space. Okay, so you've got to get, when I say this stuff is fiddly, it's really fiddly. And I know that doesn't sound like a particularly erudite legal term, but the devil is in the details here. And you need to understand, okay, go ahead.
Can outside parking be considered open space?
In some codes, parking is actually open space because it doesn't have a building on it. You have to look at the definitions. And sometimes you can do double duty by doing a portion of the parking in a hard asphalt, or doing, some cities will let you do supported grass parking or paved, paver block type of parking and call it open space. And when you're working on this, an architect is always going to be working with you. Your engineer is going to know these codes, and your architect will, and they'll help you work through the fiddly bits because they've got to actually design it. But again, at a higher level, when you're evaluating the feasibility of a site for a project, you need to get your arms around how restrictive the development standards are going to be, because you need to know if you cannot make money on that project unless you can get X square feet of commercial. You need to get to the bottom line for your pro forma of whether you're going to be able to get X square feet of commercial, right? So you need to know how it's going to work. Were there other questions on this? Maximum and minimum density and intensity. Okay, residential is typically expressed in terms of dwelling units per acre. Back to the definitions, you need to understand if that's net or gross. If it's net, you need to understand what you have to net out to calculate the maximum density. You need to work all the way through from the land use down to the zoning to understand what's permitted. The land use might be more, the zoning might be more restrictive. There might be flexibility provisions that create a bucket of units and you can make an application to grab some units out of it and apply it to your site in terms of flexibility. So those are questions to ask. Broward County has a lot of flexibility that can be moved around in that way. So it's dependent on the location and the jurisdiction you're working in. But if you're close, if you can make your project work with a few more units than you think that you could get based on the as of right zoning, ask the question. Do you have some sort of flexibility provision that allows me to increase the units by giving you a public plaza or doing some public improvement or doing some other beautification that the city wants? A lot of cities do those kind of incentive provisions that allow you to add units. And in non-residential uses, the typical expression of intensity is floor area ratio. Sometimes it will be a different measure. Sometimes it'll be, what's a different measure? Miami uses FLR, not FAR. What it stands for. I think so. In downtown under Miami 21. But floor area ratio is the typical. Let me see. I think we're going to do a floor area ratio calculation. All right, so who's got a website? Who's got a computer you can start and do some research? Go to, let's figure out what can be built at 8180 Griffin Road in Davie. Somebody start doing some research. And we're going back to the beginning. We've got to figure out, I'll let you pass out the land use. Figure out the zoning. So we're going to do some of this in this exercise. Oops, I gotta type that. All right, you get together with people who have their computer and people who don't, and work on it together. Figure out the zoning at 8180 Griffin Road in Davie. I need the girl to keep an email. Let me put some music on for you. You're not
Either
getting
the
any.
internet or the website, something.
Yeah, it's
8180 Griffin Road.
You're not. Nobody's able to get to.
I think it's, I think it's,
I have the phone
retail.
Yeah.
Now, in Broward County, the property appraiser has a map layer that gives you the city zoning. It's not the original source. I want you to always go and look at the city's zoning. But here for the purpose of this, if somebody finds it on
Is it a retail?
Community facility.
How did you get it?
Did BCPA, then I did, you click the zoning, city zoning,
BCPA.net is the
and then-
property appraiser.
so you hit the city
Again,
zoning.
don't rely on the property appraiser for zoning. Go and confirm it on the city's own zoning map
That has,
when you're doing this work for real. Because it's not the property appraiser's duty to keep this, but
This takes you
here
to the city
they have it
zoning.
to. So property search.
I don't know what just happened. But then
What did I say,
each, when you
8180?
click on the red link, it takes you to the city site, and then you go to the city site. See what's going on. Except my internet's not working.
Okay, let's look at the map. Let's click on the city zoning code. Sometimes you have to bear down to get it. Looks like it's what, B2?
Yep.
Okay. So it's, and you know where this is, right? It's just west of University on the south side of Griffin. So you've got Town of Davie B2 zoning. Somebody go find for me what the permitted uses are for the Town of Davie for B2 zoning. Which is called convenience, no, that's the wrong city.
Community business,
Here's Davie.
it's a community business zone.
Commercial.
Commercial.
Commercial commerce.
Okay. All right, let's go to.
If you type in 22 with the.
Let's see, I went to the municipal code site because I was having trouble getting to the town's website. Let's see if municipal code is the publisher. Yes, they are the publisher of the Town of Davie's code. Alrighty. Code of ordinances for the Town of Davie. Let's find the land development regulations. They actually don't use zoning here. Does anybody already have the zoning regulations for B2?
It's a community business, it's commercial office and business districts,
Okay.
it's not residential.
Use regulations, permitted uses.
And then it's,
Okay. Are there any dimensional, has anybody found a dimensional or density or intensity? Are there any intensity restrictions on B2 in the Town of Davie?
Got old code, new code?
I was thinking something grandfathered. something will be permitted there, but you, anything, whatever is.
I think they have a commercial office and business districts. Okay, so we went to the use regulations, and here we find this code presents it. You got that? Okay. This code presents it in a table instead of lists under each use. So here's an example of one of those tables. Permitted uses in B2. Scroll down. And then there are many, many, many lists. Antique shops, athletic clubs. See all the P for permitted?
And for, I guess, not permitted?
Yeah, let's find the, let's see if we can find a legend.
It's all the way up the top.
Is it?
Yeah, I have this
For
in
the residential?
What does the star mean?
Here we go. Permitted use
Conditional.
condition.
Conditional.
Not permitted in the district is N, and conditionally permitted is the star. Okay, so it passed the residential again. So these are some of the permitted uses. And not permitted. See what I mean? Okay, let's see if we can find the dimensional regulations and see if there's an intensity standard. Town of Davies performance standards don't make a lot of sense to me, so let's see if we can find traditional.
That's why it's called a town, not a city.
What'd you say, intensity standard?
Yep, okay, so, right, remember residential is measured, residential density is measured one way, commercial intensity is measured another.
It's 3.5 stories for height, for B2.
Is this in article, is this in this article 5 that I've got up here, or is it in the performance standards?
It's in section 33, I think it's a different section.
33, are you in Davie?
Yeah.
There's no chapter 33.
Section 33.
Non-residential development standards. Street setbacks, and pedestrian areas, street setbacks, for specific. Then they have parking signs,
Requires better landscape.
subdivisions. I was able to find it when I was making this, this problem up. Let's start with development standards generally and see what we can learn about the way they have their code organized.
Oh, it's
Well, here's an example, not for our site, but for single family, some of the things we've been talking about. Minimum lot area, minimum lot coverage, minimum yards, maximum height. Dwelling units, floor area, maximum building coverage. See, this is an example of how these standards will be arrayed in the code that you have to decipher. See the footnotes? They're making a distinction in some areas that they're measuring net and others are measuring gross. Okay, mobile home, we're not there. Conventional multifamily, we're not there. And residential. They give us pictures. Still in residential. Non-residential development standards, let's see if we find it here. Ta-da! Ooh, bingo. Have you ever played eating bingo? Where someone that you work for uses the same kind of terminology all the time, and then you make bingo cards and play it surreptitiously during a meeting?
That'd be a really fun game, and I feel like you can make that also a drinking game.
Not that I would ever do that during a meeting.
Not during a meeting, but I know.
Okay, so B2, here we see the standards. It was B2, right? So we've got a minimum lot area, we've got a minimum lot frontage, depth, setbacks, height, and building coverage. So these are the criteria that will govern how much you can build on that lot we looked at on Griffin. All right, you have to apply them to the parcel area to calculate, in general, how big a building you think you can build there, and whether you can build the kind of use you're interested in. Okay, so that's one example. Let's do a floor area ratio calculation. And you understand how much it all means, how much it means to me that you guys learn this. Because I went to law school because I was promised there would be no math. And most of us went to law school because we were not good at math or science, only words. So when I am called upon to do math for you, it's because I really care. All right, so we're going to do a 4-story building with a 6,000 square foot footprint on a 1 acre site. How do we do this calculation? Does anybody already know how to do this off the top of your head? You want to come to the board and do a floor area calculation for me? Okay. No? We have a 1 acre site. We're just going to do, it is, the floor area is the building square footage over the land square footage. All right, so how many square feet do we have in an acre? Okay, we've got a building with a 6,000 square foot, I don't even need this picture. We have a building with a 6,000 square foot footprint, and it's 4 stories. How many, so we have to calculate what the building square footage is. Is this all something you've learned in another class and you all know this and you don't need to know this? Do you know how to calculate FAR? Okay, so 6,000 square foot building, 4 stories, 6,000 times 4, that's how we get the total building square footage. 24,000, and we divide it by the land area that we're dealing with. So we've got a 1 acre site, 43,560, and it generates 0.55 FAR. Another example that's up here in my secret notes, which I'm now revealing to you, that's how much I care. A 20-story building with a 30,000 square foot footprint on a 1 acre site. The building has a 30,000 square foot footprint times 20 floors, right? Gives us 600,000 square feet of building on the same 1 acre, 43,560, generates the FAR. This is the way that we most often measure commercial intensity. Any kind of non-residential intensity is most often measured in FAR. So you'll see in a commercial, sometimes they control intensity simply by those dimensional regulations. So you can only put a 5-pound bag in this, you can only put 5 pounds of sugar in this 5-pound bag because we're going to make sure that your side setbacks are a certain thing and your height is maxed at a certain thing. Sometimes they don't use FAR. They only use the dimensional regulations to limit the intensity of development. But in more urban areas, you'll see FAR as the measure of non-residential intensity. That's what it is. It's building area divided by land area. Okay? And if you type into Google floor area ratio, you'll find dozens of little sites that will explain to you how to calculate. It's a very common concept. Okay?
They're really different for like whether you're in shopping centers or office, right? Because you're parking.
This, well, let's just focus on buildings, because if you have an office, let's visualize an office park, okay, something like where American Express is or used to be up on Pine Island Road or something like that. You've got 2- and 3-story buildings. They're spread out over a large park-like area with lots of green space in between, and they're low-rise. The FAR there is going to be much lower than a downtown 22-story office building. That's, I mean, and it makes sense. That's the one office tower next to another is a much more intense development. And if you find like bad math here for me, just tell me and I'll apologize. Because remember, I was promised there would be no math.
So they fluctuate with intensity.
That's why FAR is used, because the more building you put on the smaller land, the more intense the development, the more intense the use is. That's why FAR is used for commercial, okay? You think you can calculate FAR when called upon to do so?
Yes.
All right, it's not. Yep.
So an example of the base site, I saw the maximum height is 35 stories.
35 feet.
35 feet.
Yeah, I mean, it's suburban Davie, it's pretty low intensity level. Now, all of these things are intended to control the amount of development, because the perception is that more development creates more impact, and that's what we have to control and manage. But some of the newer codes don't focus on, and the same thing is true with uses. The more effect that a use will have on its neighbors, or the more offshoot effect that a use will cause, let's say a manufacturing facility versus an office building. Okay, they're both commercial. The manufacturing facility is perceived to be a much more intense use, and it's regulated much more heavily because it will have more impacts off-site, is the perception of a manufacturing facility. It's going to have raw materials coming in and out. It's going to have completed materials going out on big trucks. It's going to have a lot of waste that needs to be just treated or handled as a result of the manufacturing process. So manufacturing intense, we're going to regulate it closely. We're going to limit the places it's going to be. Other types of commercial, less intense, you can have them closer to residential areas and so on. So all of these regulations are controlling and limiting very intense uses and their size and their proximity to less intense uses. But some of the newer codes, sorry, it's my son. Okay, now I'm going to worry until lunch, so I can call my son back.
Go ahead and call him.
I'll call him in a minute. So it's with my son, and I know with my son, it's please don't tell me you hit something with the car.
Is he driving your Mercedes Benz? What age range is he?
My son is in his 4th year at the University of Florida in mechanical engineering.
He'll be all right.
I'll tell him that. Thank you. Give me a minute. I'll tell him I'll call him right back.
Emergency, that's what I do.
It's a good thought. Does anybody have any experience with form-based codes? Miami 21?
Yeah, we're working with
All right.
that now.
We'll talk about that in a minute. Form-based codes. All right, so form-based codes are premised on the idea that the impact of the use can be mitigated, managed, that uses, previously incompatible uses, can be side by side in the same building, on the same block, without these kind of conflicts, if the form in which they're developed is correct. All right, so very intense development can be placed on a city block if there's public area, pedestrian areas, things that make you feel the intensity of the development less, and it's good design, like windows instead of flat walls, and interesting architectural features and eyebrows, and I don't know the names of all the architectural things. So the idea is that we need less separation of uses, we need less mitigation of incompatible uses. In fact, we can make those uses more compatible simply by applying design, good design, to the form of the building. So that's the very general premise. If I can get one of my colleagues from Miami to come up and talk to you a little bit more about Miami 21, I'm trying to do that. We'll see if that works out, because they deal with it all the time. And there are aspects of, for example, the City of Fort Lauderdale code that address some of this, that they call them their neighborhood compatibility requirements. And when residential and non-residential uses are in close proximity, which happens, it simply exists in old cities, because these regulations didn't exist at the time that a lot of the streets in the older sections of cities were developed. But in redevelopment, when those adjacent uses are going to be next to each other, they're going to require architectural features to create compatibility between the otherwise incompatible uses. Buffers, again, windows instead of big solid blank walls, architectural features that when you do have to have long stretches of wall that are going to break the solid presentation of the wall, and can soften it to the person on the street.
Walgreens is a good example of that, where they do the open window, so when you're walking by, there's some artwork hanging in there. And they do it on a lot of their sites.
Aw, he was just, I wasn't going to say this today. Today's my birthday. He was calling to wish me happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
He remembered.
What time do you have to work?
Huh?
What time do you have to work?
Well, I told him I was in class, was it urgent? And again, you know, go figure, I jumped to the very worst. He's crashed the car again. But no, just a happy birthday wish. So, I wasn't
Should we
going to
sing
get
happy birthday for you?
Pardon?
Should we sing happy birthday for you?
Only if you are really good singers.
No, I said we.
Otherwise, we'll consider it done. All right. More nitty-gritty, more fiddly, calculating, irritating little things that can derail what you envision as a very good project, and one of them is parking. Parking is always an issue, and it's always an issue because it's what your neighbors encounter about your project the most, access and parking. And it's always an issue because it can be counted. They can't really evaluate a layperson who just doesn't want that empty lot to ever become anything ever. That layperson can't really calculate other aspects of the impact of your proposed Walgreens or some other commercial project, but they can count parking spots. So because it's an easily quantifiable aspect to a development, it is very often the most hotly contested thing in a development approval is parking. And if you want to redevelop an existing parcel, it can be the tail that wags the dog. Because parking standards, if they existed at the time the building, some old building that you want to repurpose, if parking standards even existed at the time it was built, they've gotten much worse now. The requirements are much greater. So if you want to buy a little commercial strip center and repurpose it for something, almost always the parking no longer conforms to the current code. And it can be something that inhibits redevelopment. It can be something that gives your neighbors a hammer to beat you with. It can be dealt with technically, but it often requires a fairly expensive consultant.
What if the repurposing involves demolition of the existing structure and a rebuilding of a more intense facility with garage facilities or development repurposing?
We're going to spend some time on non-conforming uses, but in general, if you demolish, you're going to need to build completely in compliance with the current code. So think long and hard. If there are non-conforming features that are beneficial to your project, for example, your building goes all the way to a 5-foot setback and the current setback would be 20 feet, you think long and hard before you demolish that and give up that 5-foot setback, right?
A developer that left a section of the old structure, wasn't complete demolition, So because of not substantial, just one side of the wall was left, it still met the criteria of the grandfather.
It's another thing that you need to review the specific regulations of the city in which you're working to understand what the non-conforming criteria are. And by that I mean, how much can I change or demolish while retaining my legal non-conforming status? You need to know what that threshold is. Sometimes you need to know it anyway if you're evaluating the purchase of a completely built-out project, because your lender wants to know what's going to happen if there's a threshold casualty, hurricane, demolish, takes it down to the base. Your lender has underwritten your loan based on the number of square feet of beneficial commercial use you can lease out, right? And they're going to want to know you can get it all back after a casualty. So analyzing whether your site has non-conforming conditions and how much of them you can change without losing your legal non-conforming status, and how much you can rebuild in the case of, let's call it a threshold casualty. That is a casualty that exceeds the threshold that you can modify without losing your non-conforming status. I'm getting in the weeds here. You need to have an understanding of those. If not for your own analysis, you're going to need it for a lender. Right? Because the lender is going to write based on a set of underwriting criteria of what you think you can do to make money with the property. Where was I? So parking, the tail that wags the dog. It's always about parking. It's just, and parking standards have increased and increased and increased over time. Sometimes we're seeing local governments start to pull back on that. Again, for the purpose of for urban concepts, they'll reduce parking standards. In downtown Miami, you need 0 parking for residential. 0. Okay? That's what they want. They want people to go get on the metro rail and take it's. Now, from a business perspective, I don't think that very many people are actually building residential towers in downtown Miami without parking. I know of one, but most of the time for market purposes, they need to offer parking. But cities that are trying to build their urban core are reducing their parking standards to do that. Cities that wish to encourage redevelopment of blighted areas, and they discover that the parking standards are one of the reasons that redevelopment is not occurring, they're reducing the parking standards in that area. There's an area on the Fort Lauderdale beach, the North Beach area, where there's a bunch of funky little hotels and shops and touristy things, and the parking standards have been one reason that the area has not redeveloped over time. So they ratcheted down the parking standards for the whole study area in order to, why was that fun? My ratcheting?
Yeah.
No, the city of Fort Lauderdale and the North Beach area, they've turned down the dial on the parking standards so that redevelopment could occur. And they did some other things. They allowed sidewalk cafes in places where they hadn't been permitted before and things like that. Okay. Yes?
I have a question. Are you familiar with Auberge, the project going up near the Palms, right there? Because they're actually, and I don't know what this would be, but they went to the city said you have to sell the north tower first. They have parking underground in the south tower, and they agreed to extend the beachfront 175 feet.
Okay, you're talking about the old,
the Palms are the pink ones.
right, and the old hotel that was demolished that was like an S
demolished,
shape.
correct. So now, I guess their deal with the city was they would extend the beach 175 feet. The city said you have to sell the north tower first because that's where the restaurants were going to be. And the parking would be in the south tower. So what would that be?
I have no idea. I don't know I don't know the terms of that project. Ireland's Inn, the old Ireland's Inn project. I worked on an earlier version of the Ireland's project, but I haven't been working on this new one, so I don't know the details of that. But okay, so what can we do? Let's get back to the general. The general thing we're going to encounter is a minimum parking ratio, right? And it's gonna be driven by use, typically. Now, let's think about that. The zoning of a project will permit a broad range of uses. So, a project might have been built and met the parking standards for its original use, which was what? Let's talk about a big box, okay? Something like let's talk about Circuit City, okay? A big box use now gone. So somebody owned a bunch of buildings in which they used to have the tenant Circuit City. Circuit City went out of business. They had got to fill that space. So what they see in the market is no one to fill the entire space, but they need to break it up. They need to make it more like a strip center or a flea market. I don't know what would be beneficial. But the market says you're not going to find another user to completely take a big box space like that. You need to break it up. The parking calculation might be completely different in that scenario. The parking ratio might be a certain ratio for a single user above 100,000 square feet, and a different ratio for multiple commercial users with less than 100,000 square feet each. It might be different between retail, commercial, and a doctor's office, okay? That's it's very common to find completely different parking ratios for offices and doctor's offices, because doctor's offices have people coming and going all day, as opposed to a professional office where people come and park and they stay all day and a few people might drop by. So the parking ratios between an office and a doctor's office would be completely different. So you have to evaluate the parking scenario for the uses that you're contemplating.
So you would typically see a higher parking ratio regulation for a commercial versus residential, correct?
Yeah, the residential parking will be by unit, and then there'll be a number. It might be 2 spaces per unit plus 1 space for every 5 units for guests or something like that. That's what you'll typically, that kind of structure is what you'll find for residential parking. Sometimes it'll be less. Sometimes it'll be 1 space per unit plus a larger ratio.
The formula is probably based on the number of bedrooms per unit.
Some of them will be, most of them, some of them are. I won't even say most of them are. They will be. Sometimes they'll be bedrooms, sometimes they won't, but often, yeah. A 1 or 2 bedroom will have 1 ratio, and a 3 or more bedroom will have a different parking ratio. In terms of, and this is going to come up with multifamily most often. A single family home is going to have whatever it has. Now,